I don't know what life would be like to not have Tourette. I don't know what it would feel like. I don't know if I'd even feel like myself to be neurotypical. It would feel very different. I would never want someone to pity me for having Tourette because this is all I know. I don't know what life's like to not have it. So honestly, I don't know what I'm missing out on. I've had this for as long as I could remember, and we find ways to live our lives given the cards we're dealt. I can't imagine what life would be like if I didn't have this. My advice to others is to take life day by day.
Welcome to the UpTic, brought to you by the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, empowering children and adults through education, advocacy, and research by sharing the stories and experiences relevant to the TS community.
Hello, I'm Michael Leopold, your host for the UpTic. In this session, I'll be sharing my story and my vision for this podcast. I'm 29 years old. I grew up in a small town in Indiana, and I've been living in New York City for the past 7 years. Professionally, I'm a human resources consultant, and I run a career coaching business where I help people find jobs that are aligned to their unique strengths and ambitions. I want to begin by talking about how my Tourette began. I was in kindergarten when my tics started. We didn't think much of it then. I would tic a little bit around recess. When I was in third grade, the tics had gotten worse. I had a really bad head jerking tic. That was my main tic, was this head bob that I would do. And I remember I was at an after school event and my head jerking tic got pretty bad while I was watching a movie with some other students. And I think I told a teacher that was there, who ended up calling my parents. I may have complained that I had a headache or that I was bobbing my head and I wasn't sure why, or I'm not sure what made me express this because I hadn't really talked about it before. But it was getting really bad that night. I just couldn't stop bobbing my head. I just kept getting the urge to do it, and I just kept switching it again. My parents actually ended up coming to the school. They took me out of the event. I missed the rest of it that night, and they took me home. They were just concerned because it involved my head. They wanted to keep an eye on me, make sure there was nothing serious there, neurological or concussion or anything like that. They wanted to keep an eye on me. And I told them that I had been doing this for a while, that I just get this urge to bob my head up and down. And I don't know why I do it or why other people don't do it. I didn't feel any real guilt around it or think it was necessarily weird. It was just something I did. And my parents took me to some doctors, started with the pediatrician. We went through the whole list. To the ENT, to is it head related? Went up to some specialists in Chicago at the Children's Memorial Hospital to rule out a bunch of stuff there, had a bunch of tests done. Like a lot of people, it was that trial and error process. Took about a year for them to rule out everything else. During that time, they clearly could tell that I had tics. After a year, we could confirm that it was Tourette syndrome. I was also at that time diagnosed with ADHD and OCD. Actually, the OCD eventually went into remission, probably by some point in high school or so. Knock on wood, I haven't had any challenges with that in recent years. ADHD and tics, though, have stayed. This was all third grade when I was getting tested. And then end of third grade, maybe beginning of fourth grade was when I was diagnosed with Tourette. It was 2003. And there were some people in my class, maybe one or two kids in particular, that they weren't really bullying me, but I think it was just starting to get there. I remember one would tap my shoulder. I'd turn and look at him and he would mimic my tic, the head jerking tic or another tic that I had. So I talked to my parents. I talked to my teacher. My teacher was one of the most supportive, incredible humans I've ever met. Mr. Norris, he really instilled in me a love of learning and also a deep confidence that stayed with me my whole life. He firmly believed in me and believed that I had this diagnosis and that in no way meant that I had limitations. I could be what I wanted to be. If I wanted to be the top student in my class academically or the fastest runner in my grade or the best writer or any of my interests, then I could. We would take that devotion, that commitment. Things took me longer to do. Learning wasn't as easy for me. Homework took me longer, but he helped me understand that I could still achieve those goals that I was going to set out for myself. One of the things he did that I really credit him on is he asked if I wanted to speak to my fourth grade class about my Tourette and do a little presentation. And I said, yes, I've always loved public speaking. I don't know why. I love it. I can't get enough of it. It's empowering for me. It's fun. Like most people are afraid of public speaking. Surveys show people fear public speaking more than they fear death. And for me, I can't get enough people. The more in the audience, the merrier. But I have always been that way. When I was very young, I would introduce my mom to fellow shoppers in the checkout line at the grocery store. So when my teacher asked, do you want to talk to your classmates about this? This could be a way to educate them and help them understand what you're going through so that they get it and that they won't think differently of it. And I said, sure, let's do it. So I did some research on it. I remember I found some athletes and celebrities that had Tourette's, and I talked about the definitions of it from the medical textbooks, and I explained motor tics and vocal tics and the co-occurring conditions. That was the most formal I ever approached it in my early childhood. There was in that 4th grade year. And I'm happy to say I think that went a long way in preventing bullying. That after that really was not bullied or picked on for my Tourette, which is kind of unique. Most people with it do have a lot of social hardships, bullying, things like that, being excluded socially. For me, I don't think Tourette's was ever a cause of any of that. My friends always, my close circle of friends always knew that I had Tourette's. Enough people knew, and I could disclose to others if I needed to, that it wasn't an issue. But I do really attribute it to speaking in 4th grade about it. Being able to advocate for yourself at that young of an age it goes a long way in making things easier. To be clear, though, I wasn't fully comfortable with my Tourette's, and I don't want to make it sound like I was. My relationship with my Tourette's has evolved a lot through, 29 years I've been around here. For most of my life, I could talk about Tourette's, but it was always easier for me to advocate for others. It was a lot harder for me to talk about my own challenges or to talk about my own tics and what Tourette's, my experience personally is like. And there's a lot of reasons for that I'll get to in a bit. I want to talk about the worst year of my life, certainly the worst year for my tics, and probably also just the worst overall year I've had. And that was 8th grade. I also started advocating for people with Tourette syndrome when I was in 8th grade in the midst of all the challenges I was going through. And I want to stop and pause here for a second to give it some context. 8th grade was the toughest year I had. My Tourette's was at its worst. I was twitching hundreds of times a day. I've always had mostly motor tics. I do get some vocal tics here and there, more so minor or simple vocal tics, less so the complex vocal tics. My motor tics, though, are very complex. I have a mix of simple and complex motor tics. But at the time, I had a very violent head jerking tic where I was thrashing my head from one side to the other. I might do that 200 times in a day. I was tensing my arm muscles, my entire arm up to my hands and fingers. And I would do that so much, just tensing it, and then it would hold and then release. I had a self-injuring tic too, punching myself in the stomach. I had so much nerve irritation from these tics that I would randomly get these electrifying surges of pain down my arm during the day. I also did have some symptoms of whiplash from the aggressive head jerking. I remember getting home from school in 8th grade, and I would just lie down. I'd put a heat pad on my neck, on my arm, on the muscles, just to ease the tension and really loosen the muscles. They were so inflamed. I remember my hands and arms aching so much from the tics that I couldn't hold a pencil or type. I would be at home dictating my homework to my parents, and they were typing it. Just typing or writing myself was really painful for a period of time in 8th grade when those tics got really bad. And that's on top of the ADHD, homework just taking me longer to complete. I had to hear things different times, or especially in math, I had to hear concepts presented in different ways before it really clicked and I understood what I was doing. I had the privilege of having a dad who was an engineer and great at math. So he would look over my math homework, and if I had questions or an issue I was not understanding, he would re-explain it to me and teach it. And he was incredibly patient, even when I wasn't, when I was getting very worked up. Also, this was the peak of middle school, so I had all the usual stressors of trying to fit in, feeling different, feeling like your body is changing. All of that was going on as well. And I didn't like talking about my Tourette's. I think I always had this idea that if I just told my closest friends, my closest innermost circle of friends that I had Tourette's, and I told them that they should feel free to disclose that news to anyone on a need-to-know basis. That then I can wash my hands clean, I'm good, I'm done, I don't have to talk about it, and I'll never have to worry about bullying or about people saying things behind my back or stereotyping or any of that stuff, because I have a solid friend group and they get it and they can do my battles for me. It's not like that. I learned going through childhood that, yes, you have to be your advocate, and that having a strong group of friends is crucial. That's extremely important. You still have to be the one to talk about it, because a lot of times, just given the sensitivity of it, it's a diagnosis, it's confidential. People don't want to talk about someone else's diagnosis. It's not their story to tell, it's yours. Disclosure is something that it's not required. It is your choice. But I'm here to say that there are a lot of benefits to telling your story and to making that choice to disclose. I would also say, though, that just because you choose to disclose doesn't mean you disclose all the time. There are still times today where I find I am having a tough day, or I'm busy, or whatever the reason, and someone sees me twitch. I just, there was nothing, just say something else instead of it. We don't always have to be the perfect advocate. We have to be capable advocates. We don't have to be perfect advocates. And I think that's a theme that I've learned over the years that's helped me grow more content with talking about my Tourette's. Going back to 8th grade, it was in that climate that I was approached by the secretary of the Indiana chapter of the Tourette Association of America. She asked if I wanted to be a part of this new program that the organization was launching. It was called the Youth Ambassador Program, and they would be sending groups of teens from the various states to Washington, D.C. for training. They would teach us how to be effective Tourette advocates. We'd learn the latest research and medical literature on Tourette, and we would then be sent to schools and hospitals and nonprofits in our area, and we would educate the public on Tourette. And I don't know why I said yes. In preparing for this podcast, I asked my parents as well if they could think back to when I was in 8th grade and I was asked to be a part of the program to become a youth ambassador. And my parents were just as without an answer as I am. I think it was a combination of things. One is that I come from a family of volunteers and community leaders, and I grew up seeing that. That was always very normal to me. It was always a given to me that I would devote a lot of time in my life to service. And that was just something you do in addition to school or in addition to your job. Yeah, you have your thing, your nonprofit, your cause. Another thing is I always love public speaking, and maybe I saw this as an opportunity to help others in an area that I had a natural affinity. I think it appealed to me that I wouldn't have to talk about my own Tourette's quite as much. I'd be advocating for someone else. And that may have made it a little bit easier. Honestly, it just felt right. Being an advocate felt like something that could be empowering. I think I liked the idea of being able to educate others on Tourette, even if I wasn't always comfortable talking about my own experience with it. Whatever the reason, I said yes and was part of the first class of national youth ambassadors for the Tourette Association of America. What's interesting to me is that even after I became a youth ambassador, I still had trouble in some situations disclosing my TS and talking about my own experience with it. As much as I loved helping other people with it, mentoring them, giving advice, I found it was a lot easier to give a speech about Tourette's on behalf of someone else who wasn't me than it would be for me to talk about my own experience. And that's something that stuck with me through my years being a youth ambassador. I did lots of trainings. It was a really big thing for me in those years, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, through high school. After high school, took a little bit of a break for my college years. I got involved in some other extracurricular activities and other causes. But what I found was even in college, I would disclose my Tourette's to my closest friends, but I had trouble talking about it with other people. I think I internalized some stereotypes about it, and I was concerned that other people might think less of me. They might think I was dumb. I had this idea that if I was going to be a Tourette advocate, I would have to be the perfect Tourette advocate, that I would have to understand my Tourette's, really the whole cliche idea of overcoming your disability. I would have to be me. I'd have to come to terms with it, be at peace with it. I couldn't have bad days with it. Or if I did, I immediately put it into perspective. It's okay. I get over it. I had a very unrealistic idea in my head of what an effective Tourette advocate looks like. And I think that's what made it so hard for me in my childhood to talk more about my own Tourette's. I always told people I have Tourette's. These twitches I'll do, I can't control them. Most of my friends just ignore it. Unless you have a funny joke, then I'll laugh with you. I actually memorized my disclosure speech. And I found that I could talk about my Tourette's that way. And I would normally couch it by saying, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I love to talk about Tourette's, but I'm not going to bring it up in most cases. I'm not going to volunteer the topic. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to ask me them and I'll talk about it. That was always the way I approached it growing up. My relationship with my Tourette's evolved a lot over the years. Like I said, I never felt fully comfortable with it until maybe a few years ago. And I think a lot of what made it hard for me to identify with the Tourette's and really to talk about my personal experience with Tourette actually had little to do with Tourette specifically. It had more to do with other challenges I had, internal challenges around perfectionism, not wanting to be judged, not wanting to look like the wrong, quote unquote, kind of Tourette advocate. I put a lot of pressure on myself and I faked a lot of confidence. That phrase, fake it till you make it, I took that to the extreme in a really unhealthy way. And it led to me being a less authentic version of myself. And a few years ago, I found an incredible doctor. She's a psychiatrist who's also trained in therapy. She has a specialty in the exact mix of conditions that I have. And it's through working with her in my weekly therapy sessions that I've really come to accept and embrace my Tourette and also the co-occurring conditions with it. I found that as I've learned to tackle some of those deeper issues and insecurities I had, it's also led to me being more authentic and also to embrace my Tourette more. Another way to say that would be, as I've learned to tackle some of the deeper issues I had around being fully authentic, I've also been able to embrace my Tourette's more. I think I also, with the co-occurring conditions, I mentioned earlier I had ADHD. I was actually more afraid of talking about my ADHD than my Tourette's. I think Tourette's, there was something kind of unique about it, but Tourette's, I could speak to. The ADHD, I really, growing up, I think I internalized some stereotypes about it. Whenever I did have to disclose, even if I was just explaining why a homework assignment took me longer, I would blame it on the Tourette's. I actually wouldn't mention the ADHD. I kind of packaged all of the co-occurring conditions under the Tourette label. And that's how I conceptualize them, because there is a stigma with Tourette and there's also a stigma with ADHD. I was even less equipped to handle the stigma around ADHD. I had internalized it in a lot of ways. People say that you never really overcome something like Tourette's, a condition like that. And I agree. It is an asset to me. It is also an ongoing challenge. And I didn't fully become comfortable with it until adulthood. Tourette is dynamic. It changes, it evolves, and we grow with it. Our relationship with our Tourette grows as well. Learning to live with Tourette's and also embrace it is a lifelong journey. And that is something I wish I could have told myself in 8th grade. And I'm in a much better position now, just having had more years of going through this, meeting more people with it, also the years of therapy, which has helped. And finally, just years of seeing how much Tourette can benefit me. There's a lot of assets to having Tourette's. We talk about the common ones, developing empathy, grit, resilience, a lot of conditions. Any kind of hardship can imbue those traits in a person. It's funny that I used to be so afraid of the ADHD label because I now see my ADHD as one of my biggest assets. A colleague at work once described me as an idea generator. My brain is able to think of lots of ideas very quickly. And I find at work when there's a challenge or a question or a prompt or something, I get an assignment, immediately my brain starts thinking of the end result. I can come up with lots of ideas quickly. I find I can also be inundated with detail, and then I can zoom out and summarize what I'm seeing, and I can explain the big picture to someone very well. My brain just works differently. I firmly believe that things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, that these are only clinical disorders in a world where we make them that way, in a social model where we built this world where if you have some of these things like ADHD, it is harder to pass. We live in a neurotypical world. But if we didn't live in a neurotypical world, none of these things would even need to be diagnoses. I firmly believe that they are just different kinds of brains. There are different ways that your brain can work. To its credit, my Tourette and ADHD has also made me a witty person. The kind of fast-paced, spastic, quick on my feet, brisk reflexes. It's also enhanced my sense of humor. I can tell a quick joke on the fly. My brain just works fast. And over the years, I've come to really love that about myself. There's that age-old question about if the magic cure for Tourette was invented and it's as simple as popping a pill that has no side effects, would you take that magic pill and cure your Tourette? Something I have found informally asking this question of people is you'll find some people that'll say, yeah, I don't want to take the pill right now. In my informal, anecdotal, non-scientific experiment of this, I have found a majority of people say no, that they would not take the pill, that there is something that is core to us in having a condition like this. I don't know what life would be like to not have Tourette. I don't know what it would feel like. I don't know if I'd even feel like myself to be neurotypical. It would feel very different. I would never want someone to pity me for having Tourette because this is all I know. I don't know what life's like to not have it. So honestly, I don't know what I'm missing out on. I've had this for as long as I could remember, and we find ways to live our lives given the cards we're dealt. And I can't imagine what life would be like if I didn't have this. My advice to others is to take life day by day, knowing that you don't have to have it all figured out, even when it comes to your relationship with your Tourette's. If you're an advocate, that's great. We need more advocates. It doesn't mean that you've overcome your condition or even that you fully understand your condition. Tourette's is lifelong and it is dynamic, and your relationship with it may change as you grow and evolve and go through life. Being an advocate can be tough. I'm thinking about some of the insecurities I had earlier on that were a challenge to me and things I thought were a challenge. I felt that in order to be a good Tourette advocate, I had to be perfectly comfortable with my Tourette. And I wasn't. I felt weird about it growing up. As I got older, I found myself embracing it more. And that had less to do with me understanding anything more about my Tourette's or my relationship with it. It had more to do with me digging into some of the deeper issues that I think were contributing to it. Things around being vulnerable and to put yourself out there, even if you get laughed at, even if people don't like you. That's the only way you can truly become yourself, your true, authentic self. So why do I stay involved in Tourette advocacy? I became a youth ambassador in 2008. That's when I was in 8th grade. I've been involved in Tourette's work ever since. There's a few reasons that come to mind. One is the people and the camaraderie. I've met some incredible people through this community, and they've become lifelong friends. I also feel that the cohort of advocates that I'm in, my generation, my peers of advocates, we are addressing the challenges that we experience ourselves as we experience them, as we go through life. When I was younger, so much of the programming around Tourette's was geared toward children and some to teachers. It was also geared to parents of newly diagnosed children. There really wasn't much out there to help adults and support adults with Tourette. There were also statistics out there around Tourette's going into remission or subsiding in many cases. And so I think it was underdiagnosed in adulthood, and also adults many had found ways to cope with it, or in some cases it had gotten better and maybe they were less in need of services and formal programming around it. But what we've learned is that there are a lot of adults who have it and programming gaps that aren't being met. And so what's really exciting in staying involved in Tourette's advocacy is that I am part of the generation that's building those supports for adults. As we need them, we are building them by and for us. And the hope is the foundation we're building will be passed down to the next generation so that as time goes on, there will be people age 5, 6, 7 getting diagnosed with TS that will have resources that are geared to them for the rest of their life. And you're not going to age out of Tourette programming. There will always be resources that can help you. And now the next frontier is around Tourette, understanding Tourette in different communities. So rural communities, low-income communities, people of color in other countries. That's really the next frontier, is how can we build more inclusive, holistic advocacy and an inclusive, holistic understanding of Tourette syndrome, because the experiences of people with Tourette is very different, not just based on your tics and your co-occurring conditions, but also your socioeconomic status, your family, the culture you're in, religion, all of that can play a role as well. And I think understanding that and promoting the nuances of that is really our next big frontier. We are doing a great job working with children with TS, and now we're moving on to some of these other challenges. So why do I stay involved in Tourette advocacy? It just feels natural to me. I like helping others. I like speaking. I like feeling that I'm giving value or service to others. And I do have a personal affinity here. I have Tourette and ADHD, and it's very natural for me, something I can speak to personally and give back. So now I'd like to move on and talk about my vision for this podcast. My vision for this podcast has 3 pillars. The first is to elevate the unique stories of adults with TS, as this is a group that often gets less attention. Tourette is idiosyncratic, meaning that the manifestation of it is different in every individual person with it. We all have different collections of tics. We all have different combinations of co-occurring conditions. And there's a lucky 10% that doesn't have any co-occurring conditions. But that's not to say they don't have challenges. Everyone with Tourette is unique. There's a saying that if you've met 10 people with Tourette, you've met 10 people with Tourette. You've never fully seen the scope of the condition. The only way to understand more of that full scope is to meet more people with it, to highlight their stories, to share and understand their stories, their perspectives, their experiences. Sharing diverse experiences is crucial to understanding Tourette. The second pillar is to unpack the myths and stereotypes around Tourette, around co-occurring conditions, around neurodivergence. This is one that I think our community has done a great job already with. I think there's a lot of additional myths and stereotypes that are getting in the way of neurodivergent people having full inclusion. We talk about a world where we can tic freely. I remember in 2008 going to my first Tourette Association conference, and that was the first time I'd ever been in another room with other people that had Tourette. It was so liberating that I could do my most embarrassing, socially awkward tics, and it didn't matter. No one cared. No one was staring. No one looked or said anything, or I felt I could truly tic and be my Tourettic self. And there was something very freeing about that. I won't stop until we have built that world where those of us with tics can tic freely. I want people to feel that same level of psychological safety in public as we feel when we go to a Tourette's camp or to a conference and we're around other people. When we can bring that same level of understanding and just have people be cool with it and get it, that will have been a huge milestone. That's what we're all working for. The end goal is a world where we can tic freely. The third pillar is to highlight opportunities for further advocacy and inclusion around these topics: Tourette, neurodiversity, co-occurring conditions, especially as it affects adults. I'd like to talk to people who work in different capacities, such as in the workforce. How can we include more neurodivergent people in the workforce? And what are some of the barriers that are preventing them from having full inclusion in the world of work? Also in the medical community, there's a lot of stereotypes even among nurses and doctors around Tourette and how to treat it and what a typical Tourette patient looks like. And I think we can bust some of those myths. So I think this will be an interesting journey, meeting different people, hearing different experiences, really elevating diverse perspectives on Tourette syndrome. And I am excited to be launching this podcast. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for our next podcast, which will be our very first interview.
Thank you for listening to the UpTic, brought to you by the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, empowering you to stretch the boundaries to live your best life. The NJ Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, NJCTS, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on this podcast. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any guest, nor do we advocate any treatment.